King, comfort of the Spirit, truth, giver, president, full of all things, treasure, blessings, and giver of life. Come and abide us and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O God. So, got a couple different areas to cover tonight, and one that I thought that might be interesting, as we're primarily going to talk about the 17th century, is that in 1540 the Spanish started to invade the area of New Mexico. They came up from central Mexico, and they came into New Mexico. And one of the things that didn't happen until the end of the 17th century was the Pueblo Revolt in 1680. Just to bring things a little more local. 1618, we talked about this. There was the Synod of Dort. We talked about that. 1619. And in 1620, the Pilgrims arrived in Plymouth. So it kind of, just to kind of give a context. You know, the New World was beginning to be settled, and it was primarily by the Spanish in the 16th century, and then the British showed up really in the 17th century. But you go to places like Rockland, Maine, and up in that area, some of the houses were built in 1604, 1605. And it's pretty cool. One thing that I heard that I would imagine is probably true is that for a long time the emphasis on talking about the founders of America was on the Virginia colony, which was 1607, Jamestown, and it was the official British colony here. It was, with full approbation from the Crown, and the establishment of a literal British colony. Whereas the Pilgrims didn't show up for another 13 years, but Jamestown is in Virginia, and Virginia was one of the leading Confederate states. Of course, Richmond nearby was the capital of the Confederacy. So there was a whole political thing after the Civil War to de-emphasize the importance of the Virginia colony, and to strongly emphasize the Plymouth colony. Whereas the Plymouth colony really was, this group of rogue, we'll put it in the Orthodox term, rogue heretics, who were not in favor with the Crown, and who came here all on their own. Later on, they received a royal charter, but it was the Virginia colony that really was the focus of the settlement of America from the British point of view. Spaniards, of course, started further south, but so at that same time, so right around the turn of the 16th into the 17th century, there was Ivan the Terrible in Russia, and then there was the reign of Boris Godunov, and then there was the last Rurik Tsar. and who was a weak man and who was ultimately fell from power, was deposed, and there was no successor. And so there was this whole period at the beginning of the 17th century called the Time of Troubles, and there was a dispute over who would succeed as Tsar. And it wasn't until 1617, after there was the famous false Dimitri. You've heard of the false Dimitri? He was he was the brother of the previous Tsar, allegedly. The true brother of the previous Tsar had been killed, probably either by Boris Godunov or by his brother, actually. So this guy who was an imposter, claiming to be the brother of the Tsar, came and presented himself on the scene and gathered a lot of support. He convinced a lot of people that he was the true heir of the throne in Russia. In the meantime, there was, you had 3 different fronts that Russia was embattled upon. In the north were the Swedes and Teutonic Knights. In the south, or to the west, there was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and to the south, there was the Ottoman Empire. And so, there were enemies threatening from without, and there was chaos within, and so there was about a 15 or 20 year period where not much happened, except death and destruction and chaos. This ended with the Poles occupying Moscow, and the Russians finally routing the Poles in 1612. And I believe that's where the prominence of the Vladimir icon comes from. It wasn't until 1619 that the Swedes, who had occupied Novgorod, and which is actually not far from the center, the major urban centers of Russia, were pushed back, and they came to a peace treaty. So, and they, according to the tradition, they called an all-Russian, kind of like an all-Russian council, and they elected Michael Romanov as a new Tsar, and as the first of the Romanov dynasty. He was 16 years old at the time.
And that's 1600s?
About 1619. Now, as background to this, so that was in Russia. In Ukraine, you had something else going on, because you had this, this very aggressive push by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Who thinks of Lithuania as a major power now? We don't. But with Poland, it was a major power back in the 16th, 17th century. And they had seized a large portion of Orthodox territory that was occupied by Orthodox Christians from who knows? you know, well, from what has come to be understood as Ukraine. You know, part of it was probably was under the Ottomans. Part of it was under the Russians, but you know, so the borders in there are all mixed up. Anyway, there was this very difficult situation where you had all of these Orthodox Christians who were under Polish Roman Catholic rule, and it was not really politically correct to have your bishop, or for the bishop to be under the authority of the Tsar of Moscow, Tsar of Russia, when that was the opposing, when that was the enemy power. And so a number of bishops got together and they decided to submit to the papacy. And they did it secretly, actually. And so in various times, the people didn't know whether their church was Orthodox or Roman Catholic, Eastern Rite Catholic. Of course, they used the union that had been negotiated at Florence, but had been rejected, thanks to Mark of Ephesus, by the Orthodox. And the example of Isidore of Kiev, who had been run out of Moscow on a rail from the 15th century, saying that they were renewing this and coming under the obedience of Rome in union with Rome. And the Roman Catholics were very solicitous to receive them. And so they didn't require the filioque in the creed, they didn't change the calendar, they didn't change the language, and in fact, in the norm in the Orthodox liturgy, up through this time, is that you only commemorate your own bishop. You know, how we commemorate the Patriarch and Metropolitan Hilarion, any other bishop who's around in the church. Well, it's fine if you know who your bishop is, but sometimes bishops have the same names, and so if they were commemorating, Bishop Paul, how do they know who Bishop Paul is? Is he Orthodox, or is he a Uniate? There's nothing to say. So that was when they started. The Orthodox started introducing this commemoration of the whole hierarchy into the services, so that it was clear whose jurisdiction you were under. So that if you were in a Uniate church, they may not do that, or they may pray for the Pope. But if they followed the ancient Orthodox rubric, which they were supposed to do, they would only pray for their local bishop. But the Orthodox instead would pray for the Patriarch and the local Metropolitan and the local bishop. So, what this did, of course, was create all sorts of unrest, and there were people. Many of the people were very faithful to Orthodoxy, and they did not like the idea of becoming Roman Catholic, especially when it was being forced on them surreptitiously. And so there were all sorts of problems, and it created quite a stir. Sadly, that division is still with us today, and it's actually a huge part of what goes into the current mess in Ukraine. You've all read about that, right?
Yeah.
the ecclesiastical mess? Well, you've got the canonical Orthodox Church, which is actually connected to the Moscow Patriarchate, and you've got these two groups of schismatics who are independent and non-canonical. Then you have the Ukrainian Catholic Church, which is actually a little bit rogue from the Catholic Church, and the Pope has even has had some sessions with their Archbishop or whatever they call him, and dressed him down royally for creating problems. But there's a push coming out of the Ukrainian government to create a unified, independent Ukrainian church, and by unifying the schismatics. Well, that doesn't fly canonically. So
problematic.
It's very problematic. And then you had some of the schismatics and some of the Ukrainian Catholics going and blessing the weapons so that the soldiers would kill more Russians.
Oh, man.
And so it's Orthodox on Orthodox, and it's a very sad situation. And it has the potential of creating another massive schism in the church. So,
are you able to speak about the source of that currently, or not?
the source of it is mainly Ukrainian nationalism. I mean, when it comes down to it.
Any idea on funding? Who's funding it?
The State Department, to a great degree.
Our State Department.
Our State Department.
This effort to unify their schism.
Yeah. Well, the Ukrainian government is largely funded by the United States, and it's kind of a puppet government right now. And Ukraine is completely and utterly bankrupt. It's been looted completely, and it's a tragedy, and it's a humanitarian tragedy because people are hungry, and and then there's all of this unrest in the Northeast, and so it's a catastrophe over there. But then then among others, our State Department is messing around in ecclesiastical matters, and that's not helping.
Is the Russian government pushing the Orthodox to be more aggressive in reclaiming their rightful position?
No, not that I know of. The Russians have supported some of the rebels in the Northeast, who are basically these were Russian-speaking areas, and people identified themselves as ethnically Russian, not as citizens of Russia, but as ethnically Russian, and the Ukrainian government, which had strong influence from Western Ukraine, which was very anti-Russian, wanted to go in and outlaw Russian language, Russian culture, and to Ukrainianize, whatever that means, these territories, and so that's in the East. They wanted to pursue their normal traditional relations with Russia, like they'd already always had. In the West, they wanted to pursue more relations with the West, and there was this huge clash.
So are there churches under the Moscow Patriarch in Kiev?
Yes, they're all over. There's about 7,000 of them, and there's about I think the two schismatic groups together have about 5,000. So, and there needs to be some kind of resolution, but but secular politics is very much in the way.
So, Vladika, what would happen to the canonical church if this scheme to join the schismatics comes to pass?
Well, what Moscow has threatened publicly is that if Constantinople gives autocephaly to the two schismatic groups, then Moscow will break communion with Constantinople. And what would happen with that is that the entire Orthodox world would be split. Those who follow Moscow and those who follow Constantinople.
It's about 700 million Russian Orthodox.
No, there's about 140.
140, okay.
So, but it's a disaster for everybody involved. The whole thing.
Did the same thing happen when Georgia and Ossetia had their issues
You mean when
with the
Georgia?
Orthodox Church and the invasion of the north of Georgia?
Well, actually, it was the Georgians who invaded Russia.
I see.
Actually.
Oh, it went the other way.
Yeah, and so the Russians responded, but it was Saakashvili who was an idiot, basically.
And he's in Ukraine now, right?
Well,
Or no,
he was.
kicked out.
He was kicked out of Ukraine too. He got kicked out of Georgia, and then he got kicked out of Ukraine, and I don't know where he's at now. But he provoked the Russians, which, I mean, if you're a little tiny country and you provoke the bear, it's not a good idea.
So are the Georgian Orthodox under the Moscow?
No, no, it's under the Georgian Church, Church of Georgia, of Tbilisi.
Okay.
And I don't know ecclesiastically what the churches in South Ossetia are. In Abkhazia, they've essentially rejected the Georgian hierarchy. Abkhazia is the next province to the west, and installed they have a nominal head of the church for Abkhazia, who's in the Russian church. Yeah, so, and who's not there, not present there. So, with all the politics, it messes up the life of the church. Something fierce. And the thing is, I mean, the simple people suffer, and I think that's what's really important. You know, and the simple babushkas in Ukraine, the simple people in Ossetia and in Abkhazia,
So I'm trying to just remember where we were in the 1600s with the Uniates, where they were basically celebrating as Orthodox, but yet secretly they were Roman Catholic. So what became of that?
It's alive and well.
So it's just maintained for the last
400 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Roman Catholic Church has, I think, 19 or 20 Uniate churches that are attached to it, and they see them as Orthodox. They see themselves as Orthodox in communion with Rome. We see them as Roman Catholics masquerading as Orthodox, but Rome doesn't know what to do with them, and Rome has actually told them the whole Uniate experiment is a disaster and it doesn't work. Please disappear. Which is not something that they want to hear. Or go become Orthodox. They don't want to hear that either. But, you know, basically they're What they did is they took these churches under their under the amphorae of the Pope, and nothing substantial changed initially within those churches. They retained their life as they always had, but over the years, more and more Latinisms crept in, and in some places more than others. For example, you have in Syria you have the Melkite Church. Yeah, the Melkite Church, and they came over in the 18th century because, or went over to the Romans in the 18th century because the Greeks wouldn't let them have an Arab bishop, and the Latins said you can have an Arab bishop, and so the Melkites are a very substantial church in the Middle East, and virtually identical to the Antiochian church, except they answer to Rome. But they're very conservative in their orthodoxy. The Ukrainian Catholic Church, it's a much broader spectrum between very Latinized and very traditionally Orthodox looking. Some of the Ukrainian Catholics still use Slavonic, and they still use the old calendar. They even use the Orthodox Pascha. But ultimately they're under Rome. And some of the other Ukrainian Catholics, they use modern Ukrainian, they have all sorts of Romanisms inserted. For example, some of the units will do First Communion at 7 years old, and then something to replace confirmation at 13, and then they'll have the Rosary, and they'll have novenas, and they'll have all these various Roman Catholic devotions, and they call their archpriests Monsignor, and it's just very westernized. But there are 19 or 20 different Eastern Rite churches like that, and they all maintain more or less intact the original tradition that they came from.
Well, there's a lot of Ukrainian Catholic churches through like Canada, or several, I know of. And so, do they celebrate like anything similar in Divine Liturgy, like St. John Chrysostom?
Virtually identical.
Really?
Same vestments. It looks the same. Churches look the same. Although I was in one Ukrainian Catholic church and all the icons had blood on them. It was Latinized, and so they had this. It was very strange. No iconostas. It was just
Get that stuff
odd.
on there.
Then you go into other Ukrainian Catholic churches, and it's absolutely indistinguishable from an Orthodox church. Like there's also a big Melkite church, not too far from here, out in McLean, and beautiful church, Transfiguration, and it's absolutely indistinguishable, except it has better liturgics than the Orthodox, than the Antiochians. Very precise, very well done.
Just because you mentioned icons, I don't mean to get off the subject, but I was reading, and it was pointed out to me in the reading that I was doing that there are no three-dimensional images in Orthodox churches. That they're all two-dimensional.
Not very many.
What's the history on that?
Basically,
What's the theology behind that?
well, technically, three-dimensional images are legitimate, but they are in Greek, in the usage of the Greek Church, they rejected them. Now, in certain places, in many places in Russia, many churches have statues.
They do.
They're not like the Catholic statues. They're kind of like three-dimensional icons.
That says bas-relief.
Well, there's the bas-relief, and the Greeks will even have that, but there's actual freestanding statues. but they're in an entirely iconographic style. In other words, they're not realistic. You know, that's not the sweet Jesus, you know, or, you know, with the heart, Sacred Heart thing and all of that kind of stuff. The Orthodox never went for that.
So there is nothing against statues.
Not universally in the Orthodox world, no.
In terms of worship.
No, it's the statues. The statues that do exist are used in the same way as icons are. In a lot of Russia, there's a very popular type of statue of Saint Nicholas, and he has a church in one hand and a sword in the other, and so he's standing there, and some of these are very old. You know, they're 600-700 years old. So, you know, it's. But in the Byzantine world, they did not have three-dimensional art. Now, in the 18th century, for example, in St. Petersburg, which we'll get to a little bit later, where there was this huge push for Westernization, they started using Western-style statues. And so you go into some of the, what is Holy Trinity, St. Alexander, the Cathedral at St. Alexander Nevsky Lavra. And you've got the icons, and then you have the statues up above. You know, all these carved, very Roman-looking, Italian-looking statues. Yeah. So there are some people who are saying, well, you know, it's not legitimate to have three-dimensional, but I don't think that's correct. So
it seems like they're so close, but yet so far, as far as the Uniates.
well, they are. You know, and it's a matter of, to a great extent, it was a matter of politics. It was, you know, politically incorrect to be under the enemy's ecclesiastical hierarchy.
So you're talking government politics.
Government politics. Well, you can, but you see, the thing is,
politics too.
well, the thing is, it's all one. You can't, you know, before the 19th century, you can't separate the church and the government. You know, in Poland, the government was Catholic, and the people were Catholic, and Catholicism was a policy of the state. In Orthodoxy, or in Russia, the government was Orthodox, the people were Orthodox, and Orthodoxy was a state policy. In Britain and its colonies, like Virginia, they were Anglican, and Anglicanism was a state policy. You had, by law, you had to be an Anglican in Virginia. And that's why you see Episcopal churches everywhere. Old Episcopal churches all over Virginia. And that's, you know, we have this idea of the separation of church and state, and it's ingrained into us as Americans. But that's a modern thing. That's a very late thing, and you never had that before. You didn't have any idea of separation of church and state really until probably the 18th century.
So that is probably within the last 40 years as far as the separation of church and state?
No, the 18th century, you know, the 1700s. So, 17, probably the first, you know, the Americans had the first revolution, the French had the second revolution in 1789, and that established secular, secular states where there was no state religion, no established state religion.
kind of a separation of church and state.
Well, you know, at that time, there was no separation between church and state. There was
Right.
there was the Roman pagan religion, and the emperor was a god, and you better sacrifice to that god. And if you were a Jew, you were exempt from that to some degree, but that exemption didn't extend to Christians, and so there were the persecutions. But there was no idea of religious pluralism. And I think it's very hard for people from our culture to understand that. So, okay, move on a little bit. Okay, 1596 was the Union of Brest, Brest-Litovsk, where it was negotiated. And it created quite a political stir in Europe at the time, especially in Eastern Europe, both in the Orthodox lands and in the Catholic lands. Of course, the Catholics were very glad to receive all of these people, but they still looked, smelled, and sounded funny. And the Orthodox didn't want to lose them. In 1596, there was also born Peter Mogila, who became eventually the Metropolitan of Kiev, and he lived until 1647. He was born in Moldavia, but he ended up dying in Kiev, which was still part of Poland at the time. And he was a huge figure in the life of the church in those areas. He not only worked with the Orthodox brotherhoods to strengthen them, to enable the resistance against Roman Catholicism and against the Uniates, and to establish and to keep Orthodox churches Orthodox. The Uniates, of course, were going in and were seizing the churches and kicking out the Orthodox, and with government approval, of course, and with that force of arms. And so what formed all across Ukraine were Orthodox brotherhoods, who basically supported one another in preserving and trying to spread the Orthodox faith. Of course, a couple of the most important areas in which Peter Mogila really had a huge amount of influence was in education and in printing. For a substantial amount of time, he was the abbot of the Kiev Caves Lavra, which is, one of the most influential centers of the church, and they had a printing press, and so they would print Orthodox tracts, they would print prayer books, they would print liturgy books, they would print anti-Uniate material, but they would also print textbooks. And he established what came to be known as the Kiev Mogila Theological School, which then eventually became the National University, and where they taught all the biblical languages, where they taught Ukrainian. He was a significant figure in the development of literary Ukrainian, and he was also a significant figure in the development of literary Russian. Up until this time, most literature in Russian, or for Russia, was written in Slavonic. And most of it was religious. It was the lives of the saints, it was the liturgical books, it was the Psalms, the scriptures, and people would read them in Slavonic. Well, there didn't really exist a lot of material in the vernacular, and so that became a very important contribution that Peter Magilla made. He also was a strong advocate of the teaching of Latin, and he wrote a catechism in Latin, and I don't know if it was translated into the into the Slavic language, but it became one of the most significant contributions that he made. Now, this was a time when Orthodoxy was confronting Roman Catholicism, very closely. You had the Uniates, who, looked like a duck, quacked like a duck, but it's not a duck. They looked Orthodox, they sounded Orthodox, they kind of smelled Orthodox. They weren't Orthodox, they were Catholics. And then you had the Orthodox, who were floating somewhere under the law because they were in Poland, and with the idea that the society is uniformly is homogeneously a member of the same church as the prince. So the King of Poland was Catholic, so all of his subjects were supposed to be Catholic. But the Orthodox were striving to hold on to their faith. Now, if you can think of a map of that area, you're not talking about a little area. You're talking about a huge area. You're talking about an area, I don't know, the size of a third of the United States. So it was a big area, and one of the things that was happening, and we talked a little bit about this in relation to Cyril Lucaris, is that the leaders very often were from the Greece were educated in the West. For the Russians and Ukrainians, they didn't educate them in the West, but they were educated in Latin, using Latin textbooks. And where did they get the Latin textbooks? From the West. So it wasn't in the West, but it might as well have been. And so the Orthodox were using Protestant arguments against the Catholics and Catholic arguments against the Protestants. And you had and there were also Protestants in the mix, who were seen probably by both the Orthodox and the Catholic sides as a subversive force, because they were really viewed as heretics by both Orthodox and Catholics. But the dialectics going on between the Orthodox and the Roman Catholics would use these arguments coming out of the Protestants. Well, one of the things that happened is that various aspects, and especially in the theology of Peter Magilla, various aspects of Catholic theology crept in to the into his thought and into his writings. And when you're the senior metropolitan for an area, that means there's a huge amount of authority assigned to those writings. So, for example, there were various practices that the Uniates had that they argued for, and the Orthodox conceded the argument. And we still have that today in the Russian Church abroad. and other places in the Russian Orthodox Church. So, for example, in the pre-sanctified liturgy, there is a rubric in the book that says the deacon is not supposed to, when he receives communion, is not supposed to receive from the chalice. He waits until after the liturgy is done, and he consumes the gifts. Why? Because according to the theology, and this comes from Peter Mogila, there was never a consecration. And so, despite the fact that the consecrated bread of the Eucharist, the Lord's body, has been immersed into the chalice, that's still just wine. And it's a scholastic argument saying that it was necessary to have the words of institution said over that wine for it to actually become the blood of Christ. So therefore, the deacon doesn't partake of the chalice. If the priest is serving alone, the priest doesn't partake of the chalice until he consumes the gifts. Infants are not communed at the pre-sanctified liturgy, because you normally don't give infants any of the Lord's body. It's just a little bit of the wine on the spoon, because they don't know what to do with it, you know. And so that practice is deeply ingrained. And actually, one of the priests here, because I don't pay attention to that practice because I think it's wrong, and all the scholars think it's wrong, and so I'm afraid I agree with the scholars, but he challenged me on that at the altar.
Oh.
So did you settle it right then and there?
Yes, I said, priest, who are you to correct a bishop?
Hard to argue with that.
Yes, it is. So he backed off. But he was being faithful to what he'd been taught. So I can't fault him for. I can fault him for correcting a bishop at the altar, but I can't fault him for trying to be faithful to what he's taught. There's other Peter Mogila-isms. And of course, you know, I didn't think of a really good response. But what I should have said, yes, I give communion of the blood to the deacon because I'm not a Roman Catholic. I don't know what he would have done with that. But that didn't occur to me until later. But there's various of these little practices that crept in even into the Slavic liturgical books. And remember, this was one of the major printing presses for Orthodox liturgical books, not just in Ukraine, not just in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but for Russia as well. And so the Russians were using these books from Peter Mogila, and so some of these unique formulas came in. Now there's another one, and I'm afraid I do use it. There's a form, if you remember the absolution formula for okay, there are two prayers. Your Lord, let's see. O Master, Lord our God, who desires not the death of a sinner, rather that he return from his wickedness and live, show thy mercy now upon thy servant, so and so, who repents of the sins which they have committed of knowledge of ignorance. No. I'm combining another prayer. Master, Lord, I desire that the death of a sinner may be turned from his wickedness. Show mercy now upon thy servant, so and so. Forgive them their sins, pardon their transgressions. Through the prayers of the Theotokos, something like that. But then there's another prayer that gets added to it. May our Lord and God, Jesus Christ, through his grace and love for mankind, forgive you, my child, so-and-so, and I, his unworthy priest, through his power given to me, do forgive and absolve you from all your sins. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's straight out of the Latin sacramentary, of the Roman Catholic sacramentary. It's not in the Greek books. There are plenty of Romanisms in the Greek Church. They're just different. But that one was imported by Peter Mogila into the Slavic usage. Now, if you're in a Russian church, and especially in Slavonic, and you have Russian people coming up to go to confession, they haven't got absolution until they hear that prayer. The first prayer they don't care about so much. It's that prayer. You know, forgive and absolve you from all your sins. It's nice and clear, you know, but it's actually, and there's theologically really nothing wrong with it, except that's not part of, it's not a prayer that's part of the Orthodox tradition. At least part of the patristic tradition. So, there's things that went back and forth. You know, last week we talked about Cyril Lucaris, who was Orthodox and who studied Calvinism and was influenced by Calvinism. On the other side, you got Peter Mogila in Ukraine, who really actually puts together the machinery, as it were, the whole complex of a university with a theological school and a printing press and the Orthodox brotherhoods and the monastery to protect orthodoxy in Ukraine. And not only in Ukraine, but that eventually extends to Russia as well, and contributes to the church in northern Russia. But he's influenced by Roman Catholicism, and so there's always this back and forth. In the Latin Rite, they've adopted some stuff from us. And so it's just part of this kind of flow between the different traditions. But we don't normally think of I don't think we normally think of Roman Catholic influence in the Russian Orthodox tradition, or Calvinist influence in the Greek Orthodox tradition, and yet historically it's there, and it has been there. Let's see. A little later in that century, you had Saint Dimitri of Rostov, and he became. He himself was Ukrainian, but he ended up in Rostov, which is in Muscovy, in the Russian, in central Russia, and one of the things that happened is that there was this influence and this flow of people, and especially a flow of churchmen from Ukraine into Russia. And that happened, I don't know what's going on right now with it, but when I was there in Russia in the 90s, something like a third of the priests of the Patriarchate of Moscow in Russia, not in Ukraine, in Russia, came from Western Ukraine, from around, simply because, and part of that was because you had this incredible piety and density of Orthodox Christians in Western Ukraine around the Pachayev Lavra monastery, which was a great center of orthodoxy, standing fast against the Uniates. And so this is one of the continual dynamics in that region. Roman Catholicism never made Latin Rite Roman Catholicism never made much headway in the greater Russian world, in Ukraine and Belarusia, and certainly in Russia itself, in Muscovy. There were some, but and Russia itself maintained itself as a very, very strong bastion of orthodoxy, whereas most of Western Ukraine and actually most of Ukraine, especially in the 16th, 17th century, was within Poland, or this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and so that was that was where the Uniates were for the most part, and that's where there was a greater interchange between the Latin Church and the Orthodox Church, and the Eastern Rite Catholic churches. So it all turns into a kind of a synthesis. One of the big problems now facing the Uniate churches is that they're kind of not, some of them are neither fish nor fowl. They're neither exactly Eastern nor exactly Western, but they're this kind of mix. And the Orthodox reject them because they're mixed, and the Catholics reject them because they're too Eastern. The Orthodox reject them because they're too Western, and so, but they're stuck in the middle. But I think it's probably from this group that you find a lot of the greatest resistance in Ukraine to the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. There's also other areas as well. In northeastern Ukraine, you have the city of Lviv, or Lvov in Russian, and the Pachayev Lavra, and then in the southwest, you have Carpatho-Russia, which is it's an area that was actually starting in the 18th century, I believe, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And there the borders moved so often that the people not only didn't know who their bishops were, they didn't know who their king was. And there were small villages in fairly rough mountain valleys in the Carpathian Mountains. So time moved very, very slowly. There's a fascinating movie was produced a few years ago. I think it's Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, something like that. It's absolutely fascinating. You have no concept what century it's set in until finally towards the end they're in a store, in a village store, and there's a clock and a photograph of Nicholas II, which, you know, that's the only thing in that movie that would locate it in time. It could be the 16th century, it could be the 15th century, it could be the 19th century. It was 19th century or 20th century. And the other thing is that the churches there retained some extremely ancient practices, practices that fell out of use. One of the things that happened in the middle of the 17th century was the Old Believers. What that was an attempt to bring the practice of the Russian Church into line with the contemporary Greek Church. Greek hierarchs would visit in Russia, and they wouldn't know what was going on, and there were strange, you know, what to them looked like strange things. Of course, they didn't understand the language, but for those who understood the language and read both Greek and Slavonic, they knew that there were differences in the texts between the Slavonic and the Greek. And so it was under Patriarch Nikon in the middle of the 17th century, with the approbation of the Tsar, that they decided to do a complete reform of the texts of the church. Now this is in Russia, in the Russian Empire. Peter Mogila was in Ukraine in the Polish Empire. So while there was influence, there wasn't a lot of direct contact. Earlier on, there had been a group that had begun to recognize that there were problems in the liturgical problems in the Russian Orthodox Church, and that there needed to be greater attention paid by the clergy to how they serve the services, you know, piety, and so there was a group that came together called Zealots for Piety. And two of the founding members of this were a monk priest by the name of Nikon, who became the patriarch eventually, and another priest by the name of Avakum. And so they had their movement pushed for a while for, you know, kind of basic structural reform to make sure that I don't know, that they served vigil instead of vespers, to make sure that they, you know, that liturgy was being served, that the priest wasn't drunk, that the, you know, all this kind of stuff. And there was a synod that published certain regulations, which they endorsed and which they pushed. However, when Nikon became patriarch, he thought the reforms needed to be taken to a different level, because up until this time, all the books that they were using, for the most part, were manuscripts. And not only were there problems in the copies of the manuscripts, but there were also there were also errors that were repeated from generation to generation to generation of copies, and so the text gradually, over the course of history, diverged from its original. And so they decided to bring in some scholars who would correct the texts. And one of these was by the name of Maxim the Greek. He's shown in his icons. He's shown with a huge beard, this massive beard. Unfortunately, they didn't have the resources to do a great historical comparison of ancient texts to bring the Russian texts into line with the best examples of ancient Byzantine text. And so what they ended up doing was they used the most recent printing of the Greek text, hot off the press from Venice, which was where a lot of the texts were printed of the Russian of many of the Orthodox churches. Remember, in Greece, it was all under Ottoman control, there was the Polish Peter Mogil's press in Kiev, but then the Tsar wouldn't have and the patriarchal church wouldn't have been able to do business with the Metropolitan of Kiev because it was in a hostile country. And so it was easier to get texts from Venice. And it's interesting to look at some of those texts, quite frankly. Some of them have parallel columns of Greek, Latin, and Slavonic. So instead of the ancient version of the text, it was the contemporary version, as it was being used in the Greek churches, and it was retranslated. Now, when there's a retranslation, they change a lot. They change familiar words and familiar phrases, and there were other things that were changed as well. One of which was the sign of the cross. The Russians had gotten into the practice of instead of making the sign of the cross like this, with the 3 fingers and the 2 down, they would make it like this, with 2 fingers up and 3 down. And with the same meaning, the 2 for the 2 natures of Christ, the 3 for the Trinity, only they would go top of the head and down, and shoulder to shoulder, and then bow. Whereas the Greeks were a little less pointed. Yes, pointed in how they made the sign of the cross. Another thing that was different was, you know how at the end of the Psalms we say Alleluia, 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 glory to thee, O God, 3 times. Well, the old believers said it twice. Not 3 times. Which, I mean, it's not a big deal on one hand. On the other hand, if your entire life is based around the services of the church, and you know the services inside out, backwards and forwards, these little things are great irritations. So not only are familiar words and familiar phrases gone, but even familiar gestures are changed. And so as a result, the books that were the result of this revision were rejected by a substantial part of the church. However, remember, it's a state church, and so to reject the liturgical reforms is treason against the Tsar and against the government. And so it created a huge stir. Now, about 25% of the Russian church went off into schism as a result of this. And which is I think a pretty serious thing. All the leaders of the movement to reject the revision, such as Archpriest Avvakum and others, were seized by the government, and the movement was labeled Old Believers or Old Ritualists, and it still exists today. Unfortunately, because essentially the accusation was treason, some of the leaders of the movement were executed, and this brings up another interesting kind of sad issue, is that even at this time there was also a presence of Dominicans in Moscow, influencing the Orthodox Church. The Dominican order was in charge of the Inquisition in the West, and so they influenced how the Orthodox dealt with some of their ecclesiastical law cases, and that was one of them. And it's a very sad thing, because very, very seldom in the Orthodox world do you ever have anybody executed for ecclesiastical disobedience. It was not something normal.
So was there torture to make you repent or deny?
Imprisonment?
Or were you just shot?
I think
Like Inquisition?
I think it was more like the Inquisition. I don't know exactly. You can read all about it. You can read the life of Archpriest Avvakum.
How do you spell his name?
Avvakum. Habakkuk, or Habakkuk, is the English.
So the Old Believers were the people who had brought in the reforms?
They were the ones who rejected the reforms.
They rejected the reforms, okay. I was kind of confused.
Right. They were trying to push the canons of a council called the Stoglov, the 100, which means 100 chapters, which was a previous reform movement from about 20 or 30 years earlier, basically to clean up the life of the church.
And the Zealots for Piety, these were the Old Believers.
Those were the people who were pushing the Stoglov council. But then when this other aspect, or when this other policy was inaugurated by the patriarch, Patriarch Niton, who had been a member of the Zealots of Piety, they turned against him and against his reform. So there's always a personal element in all this stuff. And that was in the 1660s. Yeah, I don't have those notes. Okay. Well, I can get into Peter the Great, or we can break because of the feast day and have a. So, does this kind of hang together? Okay. There wasn't much going on in Greece, or in the Greek world, because of the Ottoman Empire. What they were doing was they were consolidating. The Ottomans were consolidating their control over the church and developing the system of the millet, in which the Patriarch of Constantinople was put as head of all the Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire. Now, that basically included not just Constantinople, but Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, Syria, Egypt, and then all of North Africa. So the head of all the Christians in the was the Patriarch of Constantinople, and all of the other patriarchates were, I won't say suppressed, but they essentially became kind of nominal. They lost authority. There were still patriarchs. Some of them remained in place. Many of them lived in Constantinople, which of course was the capital of the Ottoman Empire now. But all the administration for all the Christian churches flowed through the Greek Patriarch. And that took a while to put together. That didn't happen immediately once the Turks took over in 1453. It took a couple hundred years for it to kind of settle into a system. In the meantime, there were the Ottoman Empire was at war on and off with all sorts of various of the powers around it. And in the West, in the 17th century, beginning of the 17th century, you had the continuing drama of Protestantism unfolding itself, and all the Anabaptist movement developing, reactions against Calvinism. First the Arminians, but then there were others. States and city-states adopting various forms of Protestantism or returning to Rome and moving back and forth. And it was a very fluid situation in Europe in the 17th century. There was no German state. The Holy Roman Empire was probably basically there nominally, but it was before Europe had really kind of coalesced into states. So it was basically city-states that were kind of in alliance with one another. Until you got to the Poles and the Ottomans. And then things started happening long around in the 18th century.
It's kind of overwhelming to see the influence of the Latins and how divisive they were. You're talking about, early in 1540, the Spanish were coming into New Mexico, which I imagine was a heavy Latin influence. And then,
well, to say Latin influence is
Roman Catholic.
It would be, yeah. I mean, they converted the pagans basically. Pagan Indians.
And then you have Metropolitan Jonah, is that
Peter Mogila.
And then how divisive he was, and the whole Uniates, the old believers coming out of that.
Peter Mogila was Orthodox. He wasn't divisive.
Well, a lot of the things that came out of it, though, seemed divisive.
Well, he was trying to hold the Orthodox together against the Roman Catholics and against the Unions.
I see.
Two questions. One, are there any Old Believers sects in Russia now? That
Oh yeah,
Yes.
there's lots.
So,
There are several,
Yeah.
several groups, and there's a bunch in the United States as well, and then scattered throughout the world. The Old Believers broke into several different groups with several different kinds of arrangements. There are the ones who had clergy and the ones who had no clergy. The ones who had clergy retained normal Orthodox usage, normal Orthodox life, but they continued to celebrate the services according to the old rite, and they were very jealous. They wouldn't permit new Niconian rite clergy, especially, to commune or to have anything to do with them. But then there were the so-called bezpopovci, who were the Old Believers who rejected, where the priests that they had that went with them initially died. And so they were left without clergy. And so some of them have been without clergy now for what, 350 years. And so they developed a whole way of trying to be Orthodox. So they would sing the services, and they would, but of course there was no communion, there was no chrismation, there was believer baptism. There's one group that I heard about where they had preserved some Eucharistic bread from the 17th century, and so once a year everyone would come up and lick it.
keep it moist.
Well, that was communion.
Now, are there seminaries of Old Believers?
I don't know.
Anything like that, or-
There probably there's
Monasteries?
There are no priests.
there are with the bezpopovci there's no priests, and I'm sure there's no schools or anything like that. They're kind of like an Orthodox version of the Amish. But with the Old Believers with clergy, there's basically a division between two groups. One are the ones who are totally independent, in schism from the Orthodox Church. And then there's a group called Jedinoverci, One Faith, and they have reconciled with the Orthodox Church. In fact, Brockor has a large parish of Jedinoverci in Erie, Pennsylvania, and they've produced some very beautiful stuff. It's a large community, and they realized that they were going to lose their kids, so they translated everything into English. And so far as I can see, some of their translations are the best translations that any of the jurisdictions have put out. Some of them are not, but they put out some beautiful books, and it's quite. They still sing the services in Znameni chant, the old styles chant. No harmonies, no mixed choirs, anything like that. It's the ancient style, but now in English. There's a move in the hierarchy of the Russian Orthodox Church, actually being pushed by Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev to try and reconcile the Old Believers to the Church, and he himself will also celebrate in the Old Believer style. There's not much difference when it comes to the liturgy. I think there's probably more difference. The services, like the vigil, is probably very long. They probably don't cut anything. So Saturday night vigil would be 4 or 5 hours. It's a challenging, hardcore religion.
Do they call themselves Old Believers?
They call themselves Orthodox Christians.
Yeah, because the church left them.
Right.
That's always the way, right?
Yeah.
So are part of that group the genuine or true Orthodox?
No, those are Greek old calendars.
Oh,
And that comes out of the schism from the 1920s.
they're not canonical.
No. But, for example, for most of the Old Believers, we would receive them by baptism, because we would accept their believer baptism, but it's better that they have the whole thing, and they have no chrismation, that they have no communion. But there's actually a fair amount of publicity on some of the Old Believers, and some of them. There's a huge community around just south of Portland, Oregon. There's another large community in Alaska, and then there's some that are scattered.
And are there native-born Americans or converts to the Old Believers, like there might be in the Roper?
I'm sure there are, probably in places like Erie, but for the most part, I doubt it. I think it's a pretty closed ethnic community.
Well, with no priest, how can you have the marriage or sacrament?
Well, any Baptists do it.
Oh, yeah.
It's the same. They would have somebody who's a designated official, yeah. So, Orthodoxy doesn't really work though without clergy. It makes sense. Yeah. So, what else? More questions? The 17th century, it seems like it was a fairly chaotic time. And what's interesting is there are not a lot of saints from the either in the Byzantine Church after the 15th century through the 18th century, but also in the Russian Church. There's some, but not a lot, not like some of the other centuries. Of course, there's not too many martyrs. Of course, you could consider some of the Old Believers consider their leaders martyrs, but the church considers them heretics. So. Anything else?
I think there was one legacy, so to speak, of Peter Magilla, just the use of Latin. Didn't Latin creep into seminary education? Seminary education became, actually, his university became the model university. At first it was the only university in the Russian lands. And then it became kind of the model that was copied elsewhere for theological education. He pushed education. He pushed the church to educate future clergy and laity, but especially the future clergy. But a lot of the seminary education was conducted in Latin, using Latin books. So, for example, when St. Innocent, as a young bishop, came to the Bay Area, he could converse with the Spanish friars in fluent Latin because he learned it in seminary, and all had been required to be able to speak it fluently. And this whole era is what Father George Florovsky, who was one of the great church historians of the 20th century, called the pseudomorphosis of Orthodox theology.
How do you spell is it Pachialava? Pachialava?
Pachayev.
Oh, Pachayev?
Yeah.
P-O-C-H-A-E-V. Pochayev.
Lavra?
Lavra, yeah. Lavra, spelled in Greek, is L-A-U-R-A, and my sister's name was Laura, so I used to kid her that her name meant big monastery.
So was that last comment sort of implying that Father Florovsky considered that maybe it was not a wholly positive period of development of...
Holy, I don't, he wouldn't have used the category of holy. I think he considered it a not a very fruitful time of church development. You get into the end of the 18th century, the 1770s and beyond, and there was the Kolyvades movement, and then and that sparked a massive revival in the Orthodox world. And so we'll get into that next week. And that was throughout the Orthodox world. It started on Mount Athos and then spread into Moldavia and into Russia, as well as throughout Greece.
What did you call that?
Kolyvades.
Oh, okay. Kolyvades. Was that to do with Paisy
Velachkovsky. There's some excellent books. On Paisy Velachkovsky. I think it's just called Paisy Velachkovsky. And it has some of his writings, as well as it's a kind of a scholarly approach to his life. And then there are the books coming out of the Kolyvades movement, one of which is the Philokalia. The other is another book by St. Nicodemus. There are other books by St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, on the frequent reception of communion, there's a guide, essentially a spiritual guidebook for Orthodox, and then there was a spiritual guidebook for Father Confessors called the Examologatarian. Those were really critically important works that actually they've shaped the past 200 years of the Orthodox world. And what they do is they renew the knowledge of the more ancient Byzantine fathers and make it available. And all of that comes out of hesychasm. So,
good to hear more about that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's.
It is truly meet to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, who without corruption gave us birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever, into ages of ages.
Inspirati, Vesper.